Hello, my name is Matthew Zapata. I'm here with my co-host Max for another episode of Stories of Our People, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing Luis Rodriguez. Hello, thank you for coming on and giving us your time to talk.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's an honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. I think we wanted to start with you talking about your childhood and what you went through.
Yeah.
So if you can just start there and talk about,
like your family. Well, first of all, I want to get into your family. Your family obviously came from Mexico and Chihuahua, and your father from Guerrero. Sorry?
Guerrero. Yeah.
Sorry, apologies. So if you want to speak on that and how your parents traveled from Mexico to El Paso, Texas.
So I want to start really briefly with my parents, but I want to be brief. They were children of the Mexican Revolution. My dad was born in 1913 during the Revolution, and so when he was a young child, he witnessed a lot of terrible things. I don't know. He didn't tell the story. Only told one story about when he was 8 years old. He saw some people with machete kill somebody. It's really horrific way to die, and it's the only story he ever told.
Especially at that young age too.
Yeah, to see this, to witness it. So whatever he went through, any war will tear you up somehow. He never talked about it. He was a very cold, quiet person. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He never would say, I love you. Never. But he came home, he worked, came home, and that's the way he was. My mom was born in 1923 during the Cristero Rebellion. So there was war. They were both caught up in war. Right. But my mom had roots with the Raramuri people, which is also called Tarahumara. Only she grew up in the ghetto, the Tarahumara ghetto, Chihuahua City. She was born in Ciudad Juarez, but they ended up there. And then somehow she ended up back in Ciudad Juarez where she met my dad. She was actually a highly trained secretary, which is hard in Mexico in those days. But she got highly trained. She was very smart. And she was my dad's secretary, and he was director of a secundaria, which is more like a middle school. Yeah. Anyway, what happened, though, is my dad was very politically active against the government, the and everything. And they denied him funds for the school. I'm just telling you a quick story. And he didn't have any funds for books, for paying the teachers, so he tore down the iron fence around the school to sell it so he can pay the teachers to get books, and they arrested him and put him in jail. And it's the kind of jails where they don't give you any food. My mom had to bring food every day, otherwise he wouldn't eat. He would eat out of a rusty tin can, and he was he wasn't there like a long time, but enough, like 6 months.
So it's like very inhumane
conditions. And in 6 months in those kind of jails is like 6 years in prison. So when he got out, he was very disappointed with Mexico, and him and my mom decided to come to the United States. It took a while, but they ended up in the United States. I was 2 years old. I was born at El Paso, so they had my three youngest. The four kids that my mom had with my dad were all born in the U.S. My dad had four other kids, my half-brothers and sisters, they were all born in Mexico. Okay. And he left 2 or 3 of them in Mexico, and one stayed. Well, I never met him till I was 45 years old. He just, you know how that goes. Yeah. But the 4 of us were brought over to the United States, and I was 2 years old. And we ended up in Watts, which is a really beautiful, strong community.
San Gabriel.
It's Watts. This is Watts. This is in South LA, Central LA.
How did you get from El Paso to Watts?
I think they just ended up there. In those days, there was restrictive covenants. Mexicans and blacks could not live anywhere. So they had certain places you can live. And Watts was one of them. The Maravilla projects was the other, but my mom didn't want us in a housing project. So we ended up in Watts. It was a black and brown community, still is, and it was my first world that I entered. The only thing I will say is that when I went to school, I spoke nothing but Spanish, and they didn't have any place for us in the school.
Right. There would be severe punishments for students.
Yeah, they punished you. I got slapped across the face when I was 6 years old for saying something in Spanish. Yeah. I think it's in the book, all that stuff. And it really messes with you, And I learned to be very quiet and voiceless, but also raging inside. And,
so it's like a bottled kind of forced down rage because you can't really express yourself.
I couldn't express it. I didn't have the words. I didn't know how to do it. Later on, I was about 8 years old. We moved to San Gabriel Valley. Right. And then we ended up in this neighborhood that was probably poorer than Watts, Las Romas, South San Gabriel. It was unincorporated, and it had dirt roads, no street lamps, little shacks, but it was surrounded by well-off white suburbs. So we were in another world now, a world in which we were at war with the white community because they were racist, most of them. The sheriffs, that was their army, kind of used against us, because the San Gabriel Valley had like 100 Mexican migrant communities that used to pick the oranges and the walnuts, but those trees were gone. So the neighborhoods were just poor with nothing, and the whites moved in all around where there used to be groves. They moved in. So I didn't realize how bad things could be. We were poor in Watts, but I never thought about poverty until I lived there. Then you can see the differences. You can walk from one little neighborhood into...
Because around this time, there was just like redlining. This happened during redlining.
Absolutely, yeah.
There was a bunch of political issues and like societal issues going around that time period.
In fact, our schools didn't have any books or discarded books. We didn't have any materials. All the teachers were the teachers that nobody else wanted. 80-year-old teachers trying to teach us. Not all of them were like that, but there was a lot of...
and this was in
So this was the late 60s, more or less. I was thinking I was 64, I was 10 years old, so around that time, 10, 11, 12. And so what happened is I fell through the cracks. Unlike my brothers and sisters and like a lot of people, I was raging. I didn't have a voice. The local gang, we were little social clubs, but they were all gang banging, but we were little social clubs. I joined them. I just didn't have any sense that the family was really family. There wasn't much love in the family, I felt.
So you felt like when you joined these gangs, it was more of a closer-knit community?
It was. We were all lost boys and found each other. But it was another world, too, because when we were all cholos, and I didn't know what cholos was, but I noticed that cholos, everybody respected them, everybody was scared of them, girls liked them. I wanted to be a cholo because I was so empty inside, I was being bullied and I was being knocked around, and I'm like, I'm going to be a cholo, man. I'm going to be a gangster. And we didn't call it gangs, but I wanted to be a cholo.
What did you call it then?
We just called it clubs.
Clubs?
Or cliques. We were just... It was gangs is something that somebody else put on us.
Was that
or barrios? We call them barrios. Our neighborhoods,
Yeah. Would you say that gangs came from more of the outside or the white communities where police came in and they called it gangs?
I think that's what it was, because we were just homies. We lived in the neighborhood. We cared for each other, and not all of them were criminally inclined. We just cared for each other. But with lost boys, there's always going to be a criminal element. They're going to try to push you in that area, and I fell for it because I was so empty. The heroin, for some reason, heroin was very popular in our neighborhood, not in the white neighborhoods, in our neighborhood, which I think was kind of by design. You know what I'm saying? We didn't create heroin, but the guns were everywhere. It's like, why? We had access to guns and heroin.
Because of the Vietnam War. And,
I agree with that. The
drugs came in, weapons came in. You have a lot of people that are coming back. Even by the time you settled into Watts, you had the post-World War II era, and then you had Vietnam War shortly after.
Yeah. And you also have all the protests against the Vietnam War, especially with the
which you participated
in. And I took part in that. But before I did, I got into the gangs, and I got into the violence. I didn't know. One of my homies got killed, I think it was 1969, with a gun. After that, nobody was fighting anymore. They were all using guns, drive-bys. It was all about firearms.
When when your homie first died, what was your reactions like? Can you describe what happened if you were there, or like what?
No, I wasn't there, but he was. The social clubs were fighting each other. And there was and I don't want to mention the names. It's in the book, but there was one from Maravilla, and they were at war with a social club that we call the Animal Tribe, and from South San Gabriel, that area, and they killed the president of the Animal Tribe, who was my homie. But what happened is Lomas del Barrio just incorporated all the social clubs. So you got to join us. We'll protect you. We're strong. Nobody can mess with you. So we all joined Las Lomas gang, just like I think the social club in Maravilla joined the Maravilla gang, because there was 25 Maravilla gangs, and they joined one of them because the gangs. And they started calling them gangs by then. The barrios were incorporating all of them, all the social clubs.
But then all those social clubs and bringing them all together was just a bunch of, I don't want to say kids, because at that point you're still very young.
We were very young.
It was like, how old were you when you first joined that?
I joined 11 years old.
11 years old.
And it was a social club, but we were already fighting people. There were some of us stealing. There was already, but the barrio gets you in another level, Yeah. Now you're doing heavier crimes when you're into that, and heroin was very big.
I have a question for you. So obviously the Cholo era was rising up during that time.
Yeah.
Could you, and before that came the Pachuco era.
That's right.
So could you explain the difference between those two and when, like the time where, like around what time the Cholo era started?
So, the Cholo era came around the 50s and 60s. Pachucos were like in the 30s, 40s. But what happened is they were arresting Pachuco during the Pachuco riots of 1943. The police went overboard to arrest Pachucos everywhere. So the prison system that used to be majority white with some blacks and Mexicans was getting overwhelmed with Mexicans. And they even have their own Chicano tanks in the county jail because there were so many of them. They were just mass incarceration. Just arresting a bunch of kids. And that's when the gang thing, I think, began to develop, the idea that we're gangs. So
it's from that idea of, violence, and this is like they blanketed an entire group and use that as justification to start incarcerating people en masse.
And then once you're in prison, you get to learn higher ends of crime. People start thinking about what else could we do. So by the time the Cholos came out, you already had established an old Chicano gang structure in the prison that was very powerful, and they were influencing all the street gangs. And that's so the Cholos were kind of like the newer version of Pachucos, only they were more, I want to say they were more like summer, more like easier to ride. We had the long tees, we had the penalties, we had the khaki pants. A lot of it came from juvenile hall and the prisons, the way they dressed you, but we made it our style. Nobody was doing that. The tattoos, which the Pachucos were really big in, we just took it to new levels. People were not tattooing themselves except us. I mean, maybe sailors, maybe a few prisoners, Bikers even took it from us. They have all these bikers tattoos, but they took it from the Chicanos. We created that style.
So you think that your era, which you grew up in, was more a result of the mass incarcerations and the blunt racism that Chicanos face?
They went after these Chicano kids and martial law in all these neighborhoods. Just, the Zusa riot was actually white sailors and police attacking Mexicans, but they didn't do nothing to them. They went after the Mexicans.
Right. Because they entered Mexican neighborhoods, beat people up, and then, I feel like that's one part of it. It's like we don't hear about that.
No,
that's
I know. Yeah. When I was growing up, again, I get what's going on. The sheriffs were the big army against us, like I said, and they ended up killing 4 of my friends. 2 of them were my best friends. I'm talking about unarmed Chicano kids killed. There was people killed, but they were shooting at cops or they were robbing. I'm talking about the ones that got unarmed and killed by sheriffs just because they were Chicano kids.
How old were you when that?
By then I was a teenager. I started doing heroin at 12, and then I was in and out of jails by 13, and juvenile hall, and I was in 2 adult facilities. And then by 15, my parents threw me out of the house.
You're in adult facilities
in the old Hall of Justice jail downtown, and then the Mintz County Jail.
But you're not even an adult.
No, this is overall. By the time I came to adult. In fact, I was 16 years old when I was in the Hall of Justice jail. You're not supposed to be there till you're 18. Yeah, but that didn't matter. They do that. Every once in a while, they throw people in there.
They probably didn't even care at all.
They didn't even care. But I learned to be, I was homeless when I was 15. My parents threw me out of the house. And again, I always tell people, I don't really blame them. My parents were actually right. My mom's attitude was, estás trayendo veneno a la casa. I'm poisoning the home. So get rid of me so that I wouldn't hurt my sisters and my brother. Right. I kind of understood that. When you're into drugs and you're stealing and you're violence and I wasn't going to school, I get it. I never cried about it. I never my parents. I got what they did. I don't blame them.
I feel like as men in particular, I feel like we're also taught not to cry. It's from a young age too.
I'm going to tell you how important that was. They harden you in the streets. I was a very sensitive kid, actually. Yeah. I loved to be in my mind. I was very sensitive. You can't be that. Yeah. You got to learn to be hard. You know what I mean? It's the body of your life. Not all Mexican kids were doing that, but the Cholo kids, you can't be. And then when you start going to juvenile hall and then you start going to prison.
That's a different animal altogether.
If you show fear, you're done. I learned to not be scared. I'm scared now. I'm an older guy. I watch my back. I'm looking around me. But when I was a teenager, you have to. And it saved my life, I have to say. being hard, looking down. I'm a small Mexican, but I looked up at everybody that tried to mess with me, blacks, whites, or other Mexicans. We were at war with everybody, and we were the toughest, meanest. I have to tell you, we weren't. Nobody could mess with us. We united better, but we also were individually the best fighters. I'm just letting you know that's what it was. And I became one of those people. I wish I was able to keep my sensitivity. I wish I didn't have to be this mutated male. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That they make you, and that's what I'd become.
You kind of just cut a part of yourself off.
You do.
Because it's human. In the end of the day, it's human to feel fear. It's human to cry. It's human to show these emotions. It's something you shouldn't suppress. And I know what you're saying. Sometimes sometimes it is a necessary evil. Yeah. Sometimes you have to understand that the environment is just kind of forcing your hand.
Yeah.
But
it does damage to men.
It does.
As you know.
It
really it did damage to me. I've learned since then to be sensitive. I learned to go back. I've learned to cry. I've learned to be more emotionally active, in myself, as a man should be. But it took a long time. And when you're in those situations, you can't do that. Now, doing that mutates you, makes you hard. But somewhere inside, there's that sensitive person.
Yeah.
And that's what I needed to have. It took time, but people seeing that. And one of the ways I expressed it was by being creative.
Right.
I ended up painting murals.
Yes.
Those opportunities came. I did it. Somebody gave me a camera, and I was taking photographs.
Poetry, too.
Yeah, poetry. I was writing. In jail, I started writing.
Mm-hmm. That was your escape from all this. So that was your... Would you say your academics, including reading books and all that, was your escape from all this?
And I became the weird homie. Now, my homies never made fun of me, but they said, that's him. Yeah, I would bring books to the barrio, I would be doing drawings and murals, and I'd be writing and go, they never made fun of me, but they said, that's his thing. Everybody had their own thing. Mm-hmm. That's who he was. Mm-hmm. And people say that they make fun of you. No, not really. Because I could fight. I was down for everything, Yeah. It's just that I had that part of me. And that's where my sensitivity started to come back. Yeah.
You kind of came back in tune with yourself.
Which was really important, because you know how some people get so hard, they lose it. They push it so far down, it's hard to get back up.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm glad that I was young enough. When I got out of the gangs, I was like 18, 19 years old. I got out of heroin. I got out of no more crime. I went to...
how hard was that? Getting off of heroin, getting out of that kind of...
It was the hardest thing in the world, because there was no real recovery programs in those days in the barrio. There was no... You had to do a cold turkey. People knew how to help you. I started in the county jail to get my, withdrawals, go through the whole thing. I started to get help by people who knew how to do that. I was insistent that I didn't want to be, I was facing many years in prison. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to be a heroin addict in prison, because I know they get used by everybody. Yeah. And I said, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to be owned. That was my big thing. I wasn't scared of anybody, but I didn't want to be owned. Gotcha. And in those levels, you get owned by people, and especially the Chicano prison gang was very strong, and they were active, and they were imposing themselves, and I didn't want to be part of it. I said, if I'm going to prison, I'm going to do it as me, an independent cholo, but I didn't want to be caught up in that.
Really quick before you say Max, I think you meant, I forgot where you mentioned this, but you said that those who are addicted to those drugs are like in prison. They try to find their way to get that hit, and they become easy to manipulate. They
That's very true.
You can police can use them to
police informants.
Informants, yes, they can be used as informants, and they come kind of like a liability. They come like you can't really trust people after that. I
think drugs destroyed our barrios, and even the guys that say, "Well, we're cholos," but it destroyed the cholo culture. Not everything that's cholo is bad. I like the lowriders. I love the clothing. I love the music. But drugs, it really destroyed anything that was good.
It was cultural value, in a way. The style, whether it be the cars, the clothing. It was something that was unique to the Chicano community. I think, like going back to what you said about heroin, it's like, you don't just take it away, you destroy it.
You do. Drugs destroys everything. As you know now, we got fentanyl. It keeps getting worse. It gets evolving. We had meth. We had crack. Everything keeps evolving. And every time it destroys more of our young people, more of our youth. It destroys even the hardcore gang members that get on drugs. They're no good. You know what I'm saying? Right. Drugs destroys everything.
It destroys an entire generation of creativity and the kind of culture.
Yes, that's exactly what and I was able to get through it, unlike a lot of my homies who stayed addicts for 20, 30 years. Many of them died, overdoses. I got out early. I was 7 years on heroin, but I was able to get through it unfortunately, I drank for 20 years on top of that.
So you were drinking while doing...
That was my way of getting out of heroin, was to drink.
So you can replace one addiction with another?
Because drinking, everybody does, and you can get it anywhere. And it's a lot. I found out that a lot of heroin addicts, when they're young, try to get out, they end up becoming alcoholics. But I didn't know that. I am now sober, by the way, for 32 years.
Congratulations.
Yes, it took me long effort. I gave up drinking, everything. I'm completely sober. And I go into the prisons. I've been going for 43 years to talk to people about this stuff, about sobriety, about the violence, about the man toxicity that we see. All these issues we're talking about, I try to present it to these men and women, but mostly men in the prisons now. I go there now, talk to these guys, and most of them are open to it. They're susceptible because they know I've been through, but they're also going through it. Even lifers, some of them 30, 40 years in prison, they start maturing in prison, and they're not maybe never getting out, but now they're not the same as they used to when they were young.
And I'm sure you have that deeper connection with them, especially since you also served in jail as well.
Yeah,
I think that's really. Go ahead.
Really quick before, so we can move on. I have one more question about, drugs. While they may have been like very bad to your community, would you also say that they also brought peace during gang wars and violence?
Well, they did, and that's something that's kind of like an ironic thing that happened. When people were on really heavy drugs, they didn't want to go to war. But that's not the good way to
So they nullified the violence.
They did. And I remember when I was on heroin, we used to have a fellowship of even former enemies. It's like they weren't my enemies no more. You got heroin, I can get a hit with you. I was shooting up with enemies because the body of warfare wasn't the last thing we thought about.
But I think also when it comes with heroin, if any drugs or any kind of addiction that's really strong in that matter, you get so attached to it, you kind of forget about everything else. Because I think one thing...
You do. Well, there's two things that's really bad about street heroin or street drugs. One, you have to rob to get it. Because you can't hold a job. So there's a lot of robberies that shouldn't be happening. We rob our own families. We think you're just going to rob people with money. You rob your own barrio, you rob your own grandmother. You have people. That's one thing. The other thing about it is that the drugs in the streets is full of nonsense. They fill it with a bunch of junk. So you're actually shooting up powdered milk, powdered sugar, even rat poison. And people don't know what they're shooting up half the time. They mix it with a bunch of junk, and so they actually get worse shape. And sometimes those overdoses are because they got a bunch of junk in it. You don't know what you're getting. If you have what we call a connection, that you knew the guy and you knew that he got the clean stuff on, you stay with him. But when you're in the street, you got different connections. You don't even know what you're shooting up. And then if you shoot it up with others, you use the same needle, you're going to get a bunch of illnesses.
So it's Russian roulette, basically.
That's right. It really what it is. And then, of course, your liver. I have a bad liver now for all those years of drinking, and I almost lost my liver just before the COVID. I had a drain in my liver. I thought we were going to lose it, but I'm doing better. By the way,
that's good.
They took the.
That's good.
I had a bag here. They took it out because I'm doing better. It's regenerating. 32 years sober, and I try to eat right and everything, but it gets really bad.
For paint and doing that, would you say that's also something that happened alongside the heroin? Would you say?
Well, I actually started, I think, sniffing first. Yeah, and then it's what happens is people kind of groom you with it. It's a word that
it's a precursor to.
Yeah, they kind of sit you use weed, and not everybody uses weed is going to be a heroin addict, but if you're going to be a heroin addict, you probably started with weed, and then drinking, and then somebody gives you sniffing. I did all that.
Right, and during that time, like the ways of inserting drugs into your body progress, right?
Yeah, and then you need
different
more
methods, and then
you need more and more. You get, this is not good enough. You need more of a bigger high and.
Well, that's why you keep a community down. I mean, if you think about it, you get them addicted to something, you let them just keep feeding them. Because, if they're just nullified, you nullify them. Because that's what it is. You nullify them. They don't start progressing.
No, you got to go. You're right. Absolutely.
Because I think one thing you mentioned in your book, Always Running, it's like, once you get off, I think you were mentioned, it was in your book where you were talking about you're finally going to high school and then you start doing it again. Right. And they were telling you've got to stop doing that. Yeah. You stop doing heroin because it's just, like, I think the phrase you used was frying your brain.
Yeah.
One question I have is books. Yeah. How did that change you? How did that change you from being with gangs in the barrio and all that, and then kind of change you and push you more towards education?
Right.
and then eventually what led to you going into high school and all that, and then making those big
The
impacts.
big thing that happened when I was homeless is I would hang at the public downtown library, Central Library,
Right.
because when you're homeless, and I was in downtown a lot, I just took my wife there this weekend, and I showed her all the spots that I used to be. It's all changed a lot. Buildings are gone that used to not be there, but some of them are still there. The alleys that used to be there, the landings that I used to stay in, the alcoves, and all that. It used to be abandoned cars in those days. I could find a car to sleep in. The LA River, they had cubby holes. I knew where to sleep. So I was just showing her around, but one of the biggest refuge I had was that library. And for some reason, I love to read. Maybe because I was in my head still, my imagination. I read books like Charlotte's Web. I read 20 times. I just love the story, and it's sad at the end. The spider dies and everything. But I also read Ray Bradbury, the science fiction writer, all the way to Raymond Chandler, the mystery writer. I loved everything. The Black Power books that came out were very, like Malcolm X and James Baldwin and Aldous Cleaver and George Jackson. I was reading all these books. They were really impressive. They really impressed me. Perry Thomas, Down These Mean Streets.
Right. So,
yeah.
What books would you say had the biggest impact on you at that time?
I think it was those books. Perry Thomas was probably the best leading book. I mentioned it in my book. He's a Puerto Rican guy from Harlem, and 3,000 miles away, I was reading him, and I would relate. I knew exactly what he was going through. He went through heroin. He went through a gang. He ended up in prison. I was like, dude, he's Puerto Rican in Spanish Harlem, and I'm a Chicano on the east side, and he's living my life. And that's how I went through reading him, because he got through it. He got over it. He stopped being a gangster and a heroin addict, and he became like a hope, just like Malcolm X. You read that. They went through this, but they stopped and they changed their lives. And it became a little seed of hope that maybe I could do that.
Yeah, I know. And, I feel like at that age, you didn't, it must have been crazy seeing, multiple years later, seeing your books being in that own library. It must have been, very...
Well, it's a very good thing you point out, because I remember I had a vision. It was a weird one. I'm walking down the shelves, and I thought I saw my name on the spine of one of the books, Rodriguez. I looked, and there was no Spanish surname books then. It was just this weird vision. I didn't think about it. Now, if you go there to that library, my books are there, Rodriguez, and others. There's Cisneros and Anaya. There's a lot of great books now from a lot of people. Reina Grande. There's a lot of books in that library, but there was none with Spanish surnames, and now we're in there, and I'm in there. It's just a weird thing how life would take you in a weird way, kind of prophetically showing you what's possible.
Yeah, and I think the book you mentioned, sorry, I'm forgetting the name now, but which you just mentioned with the Cuban, it was Puerto Rican.
Down These Mean Streets.
Yeah. I think while it's a huge seed of hope for, it was for you and, being able to hear that story, I think the scary part is that this was so common in the United States that you can...
It was common.
That you can have that 3,000 miles away in an entirely different city, and you can relate to that. I mean, they're going to the same thing. And then if it's in that city...
That's why I think it was by design. Putting in drugs and guns in our neighborhoods, it was all over the country. The poorest neighborhoods, the black and brown neighborhoods. And that's why some of us fall into it. People keep wanting to blame us. I blame myself for a lot of things, but I also know that there was conditions that were already there that I fell into.
Yeah.
Now, my brothers and sisters didn't do that. They didn't become gangsters, drug users. They fought against that, and I have to give them credit for that. Hardworking, working class people never went to college. They wanted to live good lives, and they have, and I honor them for that. I'm the one that fell through, and I could have died any moment. I OD'd 3 times and came back. I got shot at half a dozen times, even though I never got hit. It's like the bullets were right at me, point blank range, and I never got hit. But
Crazy.
I felt bad because homies of mine that got shot once dead.
Yeah.
And it's like, what happened? I come out, and I wanted to die. I actually think I wanted to die. I think I was on a suicide trip without knowing it. That come kill me, and I wasn't dying.
Well,
I did everything I could.
As you said, I feel like a lot of teenagers during that age, especially involved in those gangs, are very reckless. They're just standing up to everybody.
They're kind of on a suicide trip. They can't really admit it, but they are.
It's a one-way ticket.
Yeah. And they say it's kind of like, well, you want to die in a blaze of glory. You want to die for a neighborhood you don't own, street you don't own, a name that's not going to last.
I think you mentioned it was, I think you were 17 or 18, you mentioned it in your book, Always Running. I think it was one of your friends who had a globe and asked you to point out where your neighborhood was.
That's a very good story. Yeah, it was my mentor in the youth center, and he said, I want to die for my body. I'm going to everything in my neighborhood, I was like, Las Lomas. He said, well, show me the neighborhood in this globe. It's so important. He twisted it around. When I'm looking at it, I never really looked at a globe. I tried to find the U.S., tried to find California, L.A., maybe a little dot. Couldn't see Las Lomas. And he says, that's what you're willing to die for? So it's not even a dot on a map. And he was just saying, listen, if you're all going to die, might as well die for something big. Why don't you die for the world? And he's trying to say, why don't you die for a better world? He was trying to teach me.
I think, going back to your family, how you mentioned your brothers and sisters, all that, even though you fell into that, in circumstances and things that are already predisposed, the drugs, the violence, the guns, that hardened you. It also made you who you are, I think. And the thing is this, none of this would have been possible.
You know what? I tell people that. You don't know how destiny's going to work. It sometimes works in a weird way.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of people that went in my life didn't make it. And I can't, it's a mystery. People say, well, God must be on your side. I know I believe in God, but it's like, I don't really know that. Yeah. Why would God favor me? It's not for me to say, because there was far better people than me got shot once. And I can't say, it's a mystery. I just have to live with that. But what I do know, since I did survive it, I better do some good with it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I survived it for a reason. I don't know. I have to think of a good reason why I survived all this. Let me do some good.
Right.
That's the least I can do if I'm going to. I say I don't want my friends to die in vain. Maybe in their name. That's why I named 25 of them and always running, the ones that died, because in their name I want to live. I want to be doing some good because they couldn't do it. And that's the way destiny and fate work. Fate comes in, it's the cards you're dealt with. You can't answer that. Destiny is more like you got to make a choice for destiny.
I think the part of it's. I think they're intertwined in a way because you could be dealt. You dealt the cards you were. Yeah?
Right.
You don't choose where you grow up.
Right.
You don't choose where you're born. You don't choose circumstances. But
if you're ugly like me, you can't do that.
It's what you make out of it.
Exactly.
I think
that's the destiny part.
That's the destiny part, and I think with the generation prior to mine, my parents, particularly my father and his side, where they grew up around similar violence. Then there's also some parts of my uncles who also had that kind of violence. My dad grew up in Pico Union, saw a lot of violence there. And I think, even he was mentioning when it's kind of the few in between here and there, there's a lot of violence. Some of the people he grew up with, he'll never see them again. Some just one bullet, that's the end of it. And I think it's, thinking through it, because me and Matthew never seen that violence. Thank God for that, because I mean, even hearing it and just it's a lot to take in, especially at a young age where you're
especially because you don't want to be lost like a lot of these lost boys can't help each other. They needed guidance. They needed
someone
men with character in their lives, and they didn't have it. A lot of them.
Could you speak on your mentor that you had at a young age?
Before you do, I want to just finish my point. It's like, that's something me and Matthew never grew up with. And I think going back to what you said about honoring them, it's understanding that, beyond just the sacrifice your parents made to come here and beyond the generations that come here, it's also understanding that there's a lot of people who didn't make it, and it's honoring that. You know what? Yes, it was rough. It was hard to go through that, but I can make myself better. And I could also come back and help that community to better each other.
I think what you're talking about is developing the character to match the destiny you should have.
Yeah.
And that takes courage, it takes strength, it takes making those decisions like getting sober completely. The character has to be developed. You gotta, it's like you stretch yourself to match up to what your destiny's trying to tell you. I had a destiny with books. I have a beautiful culture center that me and my wife created. As you know, Tia Chucha's been there. And it's like, that needed to have a character. That meant I needed to be more braver, more smarter. I needed to be more honest, more healthier. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Right.
And that takes a development of character. And that's where I think young people need support for. Going back to the Chente, who was my mentor, he was trying to develop that character. And he saw something in me. And in the beginning, I told him to drop dead. I don't want anything to do with you. But he never gave up on me. And that, to me, is the most important part. That he never gave up on me. You know how many adults walked away from me? My own parents. And again, I don't even blame them. So many walked away. He wouldn't walk away. And that made the difference. I'm sure I drove him up the wall. He never yelled and screamed at me, but he was always firm. No, stay off the drugs. Get on. So he got me back to high school. I got my high school diplomas, you know. I mean, like, what in the world? I didn't hate it at school, but I went and did it.
Did you
I
also
was
get
very
kicked
smart.
out? You got kicked out of a few schools
For fighting, correct?
For fighting, for everything. But he got me back. And I have to say that it takes, when people say it takes a village, I think that's a very appropriate thing. It took a community of activists and leaders, mostly Chicano activists that were coming into my neighborhood, trying to help the parents, the single mothers, trying to help the kids that were lost. And I was one of the results of that, you know, that they were there to guide us and give us some support and something.
Could you speak on some activism in your high school? Like, because you obviously worked on trying to progress your school and get more.
You got a Chicano studies
the only
class
reason
there.
I actually had going back to school was because of the activism. I was very smart. I mean, because I read so much, I was smarter than some of the kids that ended up in regular school. But what I loved was we were at the time walking out for Chicano studies. And I led 3 walkouts in my high school when I was there. We got Chicano studies, we got Chicano teachers. We never had that before. We got a Chicano center. The white kids were going crazy. They even rioted against us, but we went and kept struggling, just to have our history, our stories, our voices be given proper attention. And it was worth it. It gave me it gave me a purpose. Yeah, and it helped me because I was in the gang and then out of the gang, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And more, the foot in got less and the foot out became more important.
So you kind of walk between 2 worlds at the same time.
I did.
So you think that through education and through that kind of commitment through to the community and pushing for Chicano stuff and Chicano studies, Chicano centers and all that, that it helped you move away?
Absolutely. Yeah. It gave me a vision and it gave me a purpose. You know, because I make one thing to say, okay, let's get out of gangs, get out of drugs. That makes sense. But sometimes you don't have a sense of what are you going to do. What am I here to do? Getting a purpose really helps because a lot of people don't have that. Even now, kids that go to school, they do well, they get a job, but they feel purposeless. And it's like even now they all need to feel like I see that you all doing what you're doing. It's purposeful to me. This is like a really beautiful thing to see. It's like
especially now in the political climate we're in. You know, during your time, you know, Chicano rights were suppressed. You know, we didn't have a lot of educators during that time, and now we're starting to see that too. Our history is being removed from libraries.
My book's getting banned again. It gets printed.
Yes, your books have been banned numerous of times, and it's like, you know, students need to do something. Our students my age do not know their history, do not know where they came from. We need to start, you know, getting educated, learn about ourselves. Especially because it's only a matter of time. Like, I don't know how long it will be, but you know, if California turns red, imagine how many Chicano books, Chicano history would be removed.
You know, it's an erasing of who we are. And when you're erased, then you have no value, and then you tend to have more young people falling into gangs.
I think to add on top of that, if you look at all the movements, that Chicano movements and everything, all these other movements, they connect back to their history of who they were. And they have to kind of rediscover that. And then, you know, if you look back on it even further, it's like, how did you get from point A to point B? I mean, if you look at Mexican history, you know, we were here prior to the United States. They came over here. They said, you need to have your papers and documentation of why you own this land in English. That back then, it didn't travel. It had from Washington, D.C. all the way to California.
I have a book that I wrote. The last book I have that a guy published that I called... It's one, but I'm going to bring it up.
Here, if you can hand it to me, I'll show it to the camera.
Let me see if I got it. Maybe I don't. But anyway, it's called From Our Land to Our Land. And maybe I don't have it here. I may not have it, but I recommend people get it because it tells that story. We were actually already in our land. As indigenous people, I don't mean from the Spanish. I mean that my mother's roots as Raramuri, tens of thousands of years they've been there in that land, in the Chihuahua Desert. And the Chihuahua Desert goes from Chihuahua, but goes into parts of Texas and New Mexico. So when she crossed the border from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso to have me born, she went from our land to our land. You know what I'm saying?
Right, because we used to own the land. We and before we got colonized by the Anglos, but I wanted to talk to you about that because when I was at Knox, I went to one of a session about spirituality and your connection to it.
Oh, good.
So I wanted to ask, you know, recently you've been it's been a couple a couple decades, but you've been trying to connect back to your native roots. Can you explain how you've been doing that through work like poetry, writing?
I have to say, my mother, I have to give her credit for this. A lot of Mexicans don't know what tribes they're from, as you know.
Right.
You can look in their faces and you can see, Central Americans too, you can look at their faces, you can see they got indigenous. They look totally, but they don't know what tribes. It's a sad part of colonialism.
Yeah.
But my mother always told us, somos Tarahumara. God bless her for that. And I would ask her, what's that? My brothers and sisters didn't care. I was the only one that had an interest. How do you spell it? My mom spelled it out for me. And so years, not that long, I started looking into it. I'd look in dictionaries, what is the Tarahumara? So believe it or not, I went down there. I went to the Sierra Tarahumara. I spent time with them. And I'll tell you a funny story. When I went there, they didn't want to open their doors. They didn't want to talk to me because they're very closed off culture. But I told them, I'm looking for my roots. And they go, well, what are your roots? Well, you guys, well, you look like any other Mexican. They didn't see the Tarahumara in me. Because I'm mixed in with my dad, Guerrero, and, you know. I said, well, no, but my mother, my hair, oh, wow. So then they told me, okay, we'll open these doors, we'll talk to you, because we're so intrigued because nobody comes back. When they leave here, they don't come back. You really want to know about your people? I want to know. So then they were so beautiful. They opened their doors. They live in caves. 80,000 of them at the time were living in caves, one of the few cave dwellers in the world. And I got to go into their homes and their caves. It was amazing. The Sierra Tarahumara is really high. I think 7,000 feet up high. And it gets. And I went up to the very top. And they live in these caves that you don't really see unless you get very close. The doors are mortared, so you don't. So they hide. And they did that during the Spanish invasion. They never got conquered. There's a lot of tribes in Mexico and Central America that never got conquered. People say they got conquered. A lot of tribes never did, but they did hide. They did find ways to live. So they're traditional. They have their own language. They have their own songs, but they don't interact with Mexicans. You know how that goes.
Can you speak on your...
Before you do that,
okay.
Like going back to what you said about your siblings, how they weren't interested. I want to also touch back on the fact about when we talked about the loss of connecting to the past.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you know, how you caused all this violence, how you caused this kind of step back. We're talking about how your book's being banned, how you sever and destroy a generation growing up and coming into themselves, and their culture is severing their ties to the past because you get rid of that identity. And when you get rid of that identity as a person, you kind of just become afloat. You don't know who you are.
Right.
And after that means you're easy to manipulate.
Yeah.
Because you try, like you go back to the Lost Boys where like, if you don't have an identity, you kind of just have a bunch of lost people coming together.
That's why you need those roots.
Exactly.
You got to have them.
You need to know who you are, how you came here, you know, the history. Because I think that's the most important part, the history behind everything. Because if you forget the history of what happened, it will happen again.
And we have a glorious history.
Yeah.
It's not all we were some of the best civilizations in the whole world. We're one of the seven basic civilizations that created independently.
Maya, Aztecs,
the
Inca,
Maya,
like
the Aztecs, all of them. What they call Mesoamerica.
Yeah, Mesoamerica.
That we call Anahuac. They were some of the best, and they independently developed high level of culture, and it got destroyed pretty much.
Imagine if we learned from that. Imagine all the technology we could have
there was so
gained from that. It's it's amazing.
I think one example of that, which it's in Mexico, Montalban, where they flattened an entire mountain.
Right.
And they built those huge pyramids, and it's not the fact that they built these pyramids. It's that they aligned with the cosmos.
They did.
And to think that they were able to do that such a long time ago.
They studied the stars.
And it's like all that information, all that knowledge from the Aztecs to the Mayans to the Inca to all the other tribes in between. There's just a few major ones, but all the other tribes.
Yeah.
The Spanish came in.
All for gold.
They said all for gold.
Pretty much
the Spanish came in. This is how we're going to do it. This is my culture. We're going to force you to apply.
And
the
Spanish
culture,
even though Europe had developed a certain way, in many ways was far lesser as a culture than the Mayans and the Mexicas, the Aztecs were.
Yeah.
But they were far lesser in a lot of ways. They were great with war because all of Europe was a warring.
It's always been a warring state ever since.
They had war weapons. They had guns. They had things which they took gunpowder from other places. But the point is, they were very highly technical in that area. They had armor and they had horses. They didn't have a lot of the beautiful things that the Mayans and the Mexicas had, which is they had marketplaces. They had these gardens, these beautiful gardens, architecture, and they lined it to the stars, and they studied They had astronomy and just amazing gardens like you wouldn't believe. They could feed 250,000 people in Tenochtitlan. just with the guards that they created.
And the
out of
chinampas.
The aqueducts,
the
too.
chinampas. Yes, the aqueducts. They had.
I think
They
the
didn't have
most,
that in Europe.
the amazing thing about it is that they had no animals
No
to pull in
animals,
those
exactly.
stones.
Exactly.
They had no animals. It was all manpower, and it was all obsidian.
And people
and
still don't know
stone.
how they did it.
Yeah.
They did it, and they knew how to do it. They were so scientifically advanced that they could do it. So that's where I think you're right. Us not having our roots or limited roots means that we would more likely join the gang. It's the same, like I think, with black people, because in many ways they were taken away from their roots. They have beautiful cultures in Africa, but nobody knows that.
Yeah.
So then they find their own roots in the gang.
I think
anybody that joins gangs tends to be rootless.
I think also, well, two things. I think one, it's going back to the African American part. It's also the fact that it's just the violence in the area that was there between African tribes, enslaving other African tribes, and just being so dependent on Europeans bringing them weapons and other things. It just fed the system. It's a similar system you kind of have when you mentioned your book. They just fed. All they had to do was give them the guns and say, "Here's the money."
They did the same thing. They started in Africa and then they did it in the streets of the U.S.
Yeah, it's the same concept where you flood them with weapons and you give them some incentive. The incentive in this case was gold and other more weapons and ammunition. And I guess in your case we could say that the incentive in some sense was fentanyl, other like cash and other things.
Yeah.
But I think also that for African Americans in that specific case, it's just like there is also a culture that built in the United States when they were here. And I think that culture of resilience and fighting back is something
Really
that they're also
powerful.
cut off from.
They really are.
And the thing is, if you, I'm going to put it rather bluntly, that's how you suppress entire generations. That's how you suppress cultures and everything, all people. Because if you cut them off from the roots,
And then if you have mass incarceration, you got them all in prison, you got men, mostly men coming back and cultured by the prison world, they're not going to be good fathers. Now, many of them do. I know them. Some of them do well, but many of them don't. A lot of kids grow up without the fathers. They're sitting in prison or they're dead. So who's going to help teach them? Who's going to guide them? Their elders are gone.
Right.
There used to be grandfathers and others would be there in the community. They're gone. You got nobody to turn to. So then their elder teachers become the gang guy, gang guy in the corner.
And I feel like we're going back to that with the mass deportations and we're like rapidly becoming more uneducated. And I feel like that's where in the direction we're heading towards more rise in gang violence and more father figures disappearing from, and like grandparents, like all sorts of family members disappearing from like families of young men.
I want to say something about MS-13 at El Salvador. I spent 30 years going to El Salvador. I've been going to Mexico with drug cartels. I've worked in prisons. I worked with hardcore communities. But I was there, and I tell people what these young people need, just like Chicanos, to know their roots. Because they have Pipil, Nahuatl roots, and they have Mayan roots. Nobody tells them that. So they join a gang. They tattoo their faces like Chicanos. They got it from the Chicanos.
It was
they took it to another level.
It was 16th. Some kids, there were some in 16th Street that got deported back to Los Salvador and other places.
And so what happened is they get deported from gangs here. They go to places there's no resources, and they get really bad and violent, just like the cartel. They go crazy. But when I was there, I was getting them to root them. Let them know that they really come from proud, beautiful people. Let them know what their culture is. Let them know why killing each other is against their own ancestral heritage.
Right.
It works, but they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't allow it. They went after all the work we were doing in Guatemala, in Mexico. I was doing it, and in El Salvador, I did it in Honduras. They wouldn't allow it. The governments and the U.S. pressured these governments not to do that. The U.S. government was saying, don't work with gang kids. They just need more prisons. So they were building prisons after prison after prison, not giving kids anything.
I think the two things. One, I think, is an economic incentive. Because in the end, if you even look at the United States, where you look at it, while slavery is outlawed, it's legal as long as they are in prison. So I think there's an economic incentive because you don't have to pay them.
Yeah.
And also, I think, unfortunately, we also, a lot of Hispanics come across this border and do any job we can. Then you don't, and since there's no labor laws or other things like that, especially when you were growing up at that time, it's an incentive economically for the United States because why pay a U.S. worker? You have to pay them a fair wage, all that. When you could pay someone to come across the border, they'll just accept anything.
Right, and they're doing better than when they came from.
Unfortunately, it's still going on in Central America too, with like a bunch of workers being like underpaid, and
the thing is, the answers are in our hands. They don't need a big giant prison like they got in What is that?
El Salvador?
Yeah,
Yeah,
they
that's
don't need
super
that.
impunitive.
It's a U.S. influence thing. It's an industry. They make a lot of money off it. It's U.S. influence. They're thinking, because I saw it happening. We were creating zonas de paz y seguridad in which MS 13 and 18th Street were working together. The people said, that's not possible. They did. They turning in guns. They were getting away from extortions. We lowered the crime rate 70%. I'm telling you, I was there.
Wow.
The pressure from the U.S. to the Salvadoran government, just like in Guatemala and Honduras, was don't do that. The kids had nothing, and they went back to extortions, to being gangsters. The violence went up, and then they only answered the answer they gave the old Pachucos, prison.
It was even worse for the community
I think
because you had innocent people being incarcerated too. Just imagine
most of those people aren't even gangsters.
Yes,
they got the pictures of the heavy tattooed guys, but there's a lot of guys in there that aren't.
right. All the pictures they have is just people lined up with like tattoos, but like
they don't got all of them are not
right.
that.
Imagine the scary thing is that most of these people, most of these innocent people, unfortunately, won't last long in those prison systems because of the people.
Either that, or they got to be just as ugly and terrible as the people there.
Right.
They got to be just as hard.
You come out way worse, and you don't know how long you're staying in there. You don't know if you're going to be dead the next day or
it's
how long
a
you're gonna survive.
terrible gulag. that we
Yes,
created.
It's a gulag, and I think to kind of touch on that, like you mentioned the Chucos, where they just throw them in jail, we'll deal with it later, or in essence they didn't deal with it at all. They just created this endless cycle and loop. And the thing is, the root of all of this is education.
Yeah.
If you educate them, you get them.
I agree.
And I think
totally agree.
what I find ironic with the United States in that part, it's like, okay, you, especially with this administration,
right.
you'll complain that they're coming over our borders bringing drugs and then weapons, they're bringing violence, all these awful things, but then you were the one years ago or decades ago in some cases who destroyed these governments because they used to be flourishing democracies,
They did.
all for profit.
Yeah.
And then you complain. Then you complain that they come to your border.
Yeah.
And the
we
thing is,
drove them out of their homelands.
yeah, and the thing is this: everything, not everything was perfect back then. Like I'm not going to say that everything was perfect and dandy, but they had functioning democracies. They didn't have this huge problem where they needed to leave their homeland.
Right.
This is all U.S. influence.
There you go.
Same when they sent the U.S. Marines into Nicaragua. Other times where they sent like all these Central American countries that they broke
Even Haiti, they think Haiti's so messed up. We created that. I call it monsters of our own making. These are monsters that we created.
Because we have so much influence over.
I'd argue they're not monsters.
They're not really monsters.
No,
That's why I say
like,
quote,
yeah.
they're human beings that have been
Not even in that
pushed
sense.
to
Like
the area.
we might call them just because of the violence and all that.
Right.
But we're the monster.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
I mean, like, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to say that it's
Yeah.
I'm not going to say there were a few bad apples. I'm not going to say there wasn't. But it's also like you flooded
all
with
human beings have flaws.
yeah.
All of us. But I would tell you, you work with people one way, you work with another way. If you work with the good, them as assets, and look at what they bring to the world. Look at them all giving gifts. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You work at them differently, or you work at them as deficits. They're no good. They're bad no matter what. You're going to have two different results. And I'm for, even with the worst gangs in El Salvador, Guatemala, or even the drug cartels. I'm going to Colombia because my work is international now. They want to bring me there to work with the kids that were part of drug cartels there, and they want me to help them. I tell them they're all savable. They're all salvageable. They're all, because they're human beings, and human beings can change. But you got to give them the tools, the resources, the connections, the love. They will change, but you got to give those things,
I think what you bring up was two different mindsets that you pointed out. One is your mindset where it's like, it's a community and we have to come here and help that community. Right. Another is just so driven by base necessity of a profit margin.
Right.
Because, you don't want to interrupt that supply chain. Especially in our era of kind of globalization.
Yeah.
You don't want to disrupt that kind of supply chain. You don't want to have to stock up prices. So what's the easiest way? Well, if you imprison these people, they work your fields, they pick your strawberries, they pick up the bananas, then you ship it up, and then, if you don't have to pay them, you have a higher profit margin, you don't have to pay as much. And then it's a simpler solution in the sense of, politically it works publicly. Oh, look, we're doing this and that to help the community. And that's where you kind of get this president where it's like, okay, we're doing this and that, taking out all these people, And not all of them are criminals. I think that's one thing that needs to be brought to light. Not all of them are criminals. The same way not everyone was criminals in El Salvador. The same way not everyone was criminals when they deported Hispanics 3 times in the United States, mass deportations.
Or even with the Pachucos.
Yeah.
Not all of them were criminals, but that's their mindset.
That's the association. And I think that is the big problem, that you have this blanketed.
And the constant, like, also the constant fear mongering by the media as well. It just paints like a really bad light on these people as well, because they do so much for our economy. Like, we do so much. Like you said, we work the fields, we work everything, but now we're.
Well, the fact that they bought the lie, everybody knows it's a lie.
It's because we're so uneducated in this age.
The hardest
no one
working
can
people
read.
is
like,
people from Mexico, Central America. And the Haitians, they jumped on the Haitians. They were the best thing going for Cincinnati. They were the best. The people talked about it. These people are bringing in work. They're bringing in value. They're bringing in family. They're good people.
And all it took is one story. Them eating the
One
cats
lie.
or like the pets. It's unbelievable.
So I'm going to do 2 questions here.
Yeah.
One, I actually want to ask, in light of everything that's happening with this administration, what you've seen growing up, going to these gangs, negotiating with them, you said, they're bringing in, after a while, teaching them their history, they kind of stop the violence. They bring in their weapons. They stop doing all this. For today's world, one, how do you see the parallels between gang violence today and what you grew up with? But also, how do you think, as a nation of Chicanos and Chicanas, did we come together to prevent this kind of violence against us?
Well, here's what I would say. When I was in the gang, it was rough, hardcore as any time in any place, but it wasn't a lot of us. It was a few of us in the gang. Over 40 years, everybody wants to be a gangster. They've encultured a gangster mentality. You know what I'm saying? Even young people have nothing to do with gangs, are doing the drugs. Fentanyl is everywhere. There's nobody. Used to be heroin was in our communities, but fentanyl is everywhere. There's no immunity. And I'll give you a sad story. I have grandkids, and we sheltered them because I didn't want them in the hood. My son did go to prison. He was in a gang. He did 15 years in prison, but he's doing good now. And his kids and my daughter's kids are kids that we sheltered. 2.5 years ago, my grandson Joshua died of fentanyl.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. He was 22 years old. And his sister, my granddaughter, Anna, was in prison for crystal meth. These were sheltered kids. So what I'm saying is that it actually got amplio, it got bigger. The gang life that we had that was in our barrios, it was just a few of us. Yeah, we were tough as hard as anybody, but now it's grabbing everybody.
International at this point.
It's international. It's crossing borders. And it's like, and we did that because we deported all these gang kids to those countries. They were from LA streets. Instead of helping them there, they just deported them to countries that had no resources, had no way of dealing with them. So I think that's why I say we created the situation, and we could change it. But it has to be compassion. It has to be, I call it cared straight, not scared straight. Caring for people. And it's going to be hard. Some of them are going to do bad things. Some of them are still going to treat you. I treated people badly. I told my mentor I treated him badly, but he never gave up. We should never give up on these kids. And eventually there'll be a generation that won't even know what violence is.
They're the future.
They don't know drugs. But right now it's everywhere. And the good kids are falling into it. My Joshua was but he wasn't a bad kid. And with fentanyl, it doesn't take much. You can take it one time and just die. When you're on heroin, they kind of group you. You have to do little by little. You put it in your weed first, put it in your cigarettes, put the powder, you take it up your nose. Eventually you do skin popping on the muscle, and eventually you're working out intravenously. They groom you to do it. With fentanyl, you take one pill. You don't even know it's a fentanyl.
It's like a little speck. You take a little speck. And
you'll die.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The one pack can kill hundreds of millions.
Exactly. It's a whole different world.
Can you talk a little bit about each of the books we have here that you have up here? Which one do you want to start with?
Well, let's start with this one. This one is actually a book that I edited. This is writings from guys in prisons, the workshops that I did in prisons. And I did Lancaster Prison, and it was my creative writing workshop, and this is their work, and I wanted to present it to the world. It's beautiful work. Some of these guys are lifers. The guy that did the painting here had been in prison for many years, but they can do beautiful things, creative things.
I was actually at another session I went to at Knox was actually about artwork in prisons too. I saw these beautiful drawings, paintings, and like
they
artwork.
could do amazing stuff.
They do.
Yeah. So
And, like I'm sure, like you, you've also learned in those environments too. You learn how to write better in those communities, and like it progressed your.
And for me to teach them, or at least show them there's a way they can do it, makes them feel better as human beings.
Right.
So
this
here,
one is,
I'll set up no worries.
Yeah, so this is a collection of selected poems, My Nature's Hunger, over several years that I did several books. And so this collected them together. I love poetry. As you know, I became the Poet Laureate of LA, and so poetry is a very important part of that work. This book is the story of 5 guys from my neighborhood that changed their life. It's called From Trouble to Triumph, and includes an introduction that I wrote, but also an enemy. I befriended a former enemy, and I'll tell you something real quickly about him. His name is Freddy Negrete, and he shot at me. He didn't hit me, but he shot at me, and then I tried to burn down his house. That's how the warfare was. Now we're good friends. What happened is that he became the artist of his barrio, and I became the artist writer of my barrio. And we were enemies, but he was painting beautiful murals with acrylic paints. I was doing acrylic paints. He was using aerosol spray. He became the number 1 tattoo artist in the world because he brought the Chicano style in the 70s into the tattoo world, the black and gray that everybody uses. And so now he's the ink master of all ink masters. Well, now we're good friends. When I came back from Chicago, I hooked up with him because his son got killed by my gang. I don't know these guys, the young members of my gang, killed his son. That was awful. I had dinner with him. And my son was in prison at that time. I said, look what's happened to our son. My son's in prison. Your son's dead. Let's work together. So me and him decided to work together to help kids. Unfortunately, another son died of heroin overdose. He lost 2 sons. Can you imagine? But we're very close to him, and his story's here. I also helped him get a book published called Smile Now, Cry Later, because that's important that his story gets told. So this is my first novel, Music of the Mill, because one of the things I did is I worked in industry when L.A. had all this industry. LA had steel mills, auto plants, rubber tire companies, had aerospace, garment. The largest shipyards, still the largest shipyards in the world, is over there. But I worked in those places, and during the Reagan administration, during the 80s, they all were going down. Deindustrialization, the Rust Belt, LA lost hundreds of factories.
Because they shipped them overseas.
They did. They shipped them overseas. And people don't realize they just pulled the economic rug out of our neighborhoods. And so, by the 80s, in the 90s, gangs became the biggest thing because they could make money off drugs. People don't know that we actually made the gangs worse by pulling the economic life out of our neighborhoods. Chicago and LA were the 2 gang capitals because they're the 2 most industrialized. People don't get that connection.
And I think, because to be honest, you have to feed your family somehow. You have to feed yourself.
And you mentioned that in Always Running, that I believe you spoke to someone and they said, only if I had a livable wage, then I would not be choosing this life. Why would you? Yeah, exactly.
That's
Why
right.
would you do that?
And you see your parents working hard and very little money. So some of us young people thinking, I can make money quicker by selling drugs. See, that's just
But the thing is, it just never comes out of malintent. It just comes out of the necessity to kind of just survive.
Yeah.
Going to these, because this is a part 1, part 2. Chris.
Yeah, so this is a sequel. I think it's important to read them both because this is up to 18, 19 years old. This starts when I'm getting out of jail and getting out of heroin. It starts when I'm leaving everything, and it goes 40 years, including when my son got lost into the gangs in prison. It's about me and my son losing him. That's why there's a little baby, because I held my son when I was 20 years old. He was born. It changed my life holding my baby, and yet years later, he saved my life, and I couldn't save his. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. It was really hard when he fell. That's why I say it calls you back. The madness will call you back. I got out of gangs. I got out of drugs. I got out of jail. But the madness kept calling back, and it took my son for a while. Fortunately for me, my son is doing good. But it took a long struggle. It was really hard. So that's that story.
And then finally...
And this is my short story collection, because I still think it's important to tell stories. So this is the Republic of East LA. Just so people get the sense of East LA. It's magnificent culture and people and long history, and it's so full of life. It's got terrible things, but it's also got a lot of good things. There's only maybe one story that has gangs. Mostly it's not about gangs, this one.
Thank you for all of that. Did you have any other books in there?
Of course, but I didn't know if I needed to bring them all up, but I wanted to. This one is a good one because this is about my work with prisons.
I have this
gangs.
one.
That's a good one. My son thinks it's his favorite book of mine because he says it really hits hard on how to work with.
So this is about, sorry, repeat that again.
Yeah, it's called Hearts and Hands, Creating Community in Violent Times. And I talk about the work I did in El Salvador and in Mexico, but also with all the gangs in Chicago, mostly Chicago and L.A. So it's a very important book. These are 4 poetry books, because again, I love poetry. And I have to say that Mexico last year, 2 years ago, published my bilingual version of my book called Todos los Caminos Llevan a Casa. And they're going to do a new version with the English name, All Roads Lead Home.
Can you talk really quickly on how you got into poetry?
Poetry?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what made you start writing poetry?
Yeah, what happened is I was 18 years old and I won a writing contest.
Right.
So they took me to Berkeley. 18 years old, I was on heroin. But a teacher helped me submit a work into a contest and I won $250, honorable mention. So they took me to Berkeley. First time I was on a plane.
For a workshop, right? It was it was a writing, was it a writing workshop?
It was no, this wasn't the journalism class. It was an actual award.
Oh, okay.
But it took me to Berkeley. I ended up going to Berkeley for that journalism program 10 years later. But I was there, and I was getting ready to score on heroin because I was going to sneak out. I walked out of this hotel. The first time I flew on a plane, first time I stayed in a hotel. But I'm walking out, and all these people are in the lobby, and they're the contest people. I say, come with us. We're going to a poetry reading. I said, I don't know. I had never heard of poetry reading. But I went. I said, I'll go with them, but I'm going to stay in the back and sneak out because then I'll score, I'm my thinking. So I'm in the back, and there was 3 poets. Jose Montoya, who was the Chicano poet, premier Chicano poet. David Henderson, who was the leading black performance poet of the time, and the Puerto Rican poet, Pedro Pietri. The 3 best national poets of the country at the time. And they were all there. I never heard of them, and they got up to read. I never went to score that night, later on, but at that night, because I was so mesmerized by them reading, by the way they put their body and their words all came together. They were funny, they were sad, they made you cry, they made you laugh.
It's almost like they put their soul into it.
It did. And you know what? I got this crazy idea again, like I had the idea of writing books. I want to be a poet. And so I started looking into it. And again, it helped me because a year later, about 19, I stopped heroin. All that stuff helped me finally get to that point. And it was being able to see these writers and poets and me thinking, maybe I could do this.
It's like going back to your art and all that, everything else, being able to express yourself fully.
Getting back to that sensitive kid that I had pushed aside. I was getting back to that kid.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about each of these. I think here, which one do you want to start with?
Yeah, well, I want to start with this is my first book ever, Poems Across the Pavement. And I actually published it myself. I had to do it. But I had a great designer, and she's been designing. I have a press now called Tia Chucha Press. I've had it for 36 years. She has designed all my books since then. She did the first one, and we've been working together ever since. I've published over 100 books of other people. I don't publish myself no more. Other people now. This is my first book. It opened a lot of doors. I won an award at the Poetry Center of the San Francisco State University. So it opened doors. So
you've become kind of that springboard for other Chicano writers.
Yeah. Now I decided to help others. And then this was my second book, which became so popular. When you sell poetry in the U.S., if you sell 1,000 books, you're a bestseller. U.S. doesn't really support poetry. In Japan, poetry books sell 1 million copies. Mexico, they sell 1 million copies. In Russia, they sell, but U.S. hardly. This one sold 14,000 copies the first year.
Oh, wow.
There was so much interest in my work. And then this laid the basis for me to do Always Winning, because this came out before Always Winning.
Okay.
It opened the door for Always Winning. So I have to honor that, the second book, but it was the second most important poetry book.
This is The Concrete River?
Yeah, The Concrete River. And that's, what's one it just come out of Murder's Row, and I was trying to look like Che Guevara. People said, how come you had long hair? Well, I used to be a cholo with short hair, but I was intrigued by Che Guevara, so I was trying to look like Che Guevara. I know. And then this is one of my poetry books called Troche Moche, which you probably know what that word means. It just means like helter skelter, everything, troche moche. And I decided to do that. But I love this book, actually. It's not as best-selling as my other poetry books, but I think it's one of the most important books. Yeah, so there you go.
And then I just see
this one
this
from Mexico. They just did this 2 years ago. Todos los Caminos Llevan a Casa, and it's bilingual. So they're already sold out, so they're going to do a new version, but the English name is going to be underneath it, which means all roads lead home. So Mexico is great that they finally, and they actually published Always Running in Mexico to a version there. But I'm glad that Mexico's stepping up to and encourage Chicanos, work with Chicanos. And it used to be hard to be Chicano in Mexico, as you know, but now there's so many deportees. There's a Chicano culture all over Mexico, you know, and a lot of people have learned to accept them. It's part of themselves. You know, they're still, we're out the border, we're the same people. You know how that goes.
Right.
It's just one little line on a map.
Exactly.
You know, and that's why I kind of think that, you know, people like someone our age needs to step up and start helping and educating and mentoring these younger generations too.
Right.
And it's going to be a process.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that, you know, in order to have this happen, it's going to be a process. It's going to take time. It's not going to be something that's going to happen.
But both of you are really heartening for me because I see you two young men taking up the best of our community, being a voice for our community, and getting smart. You're smart. You know about the politics and the economics. You're not just trying to fall into the narrative that people give you. You're looking underneath the root of everything. That, to me, is what really knowledge comes from. And that's what people need,
Well, at least for me, I think it's all thanks to people like you who laid the foundation, who wrote all of this, who did the work on the ground before we were born. It's the people who taught us, the people who decided, you know, this is like Chicano studies, other things like that. My parents who pushed us to learn about our history, something that I've always been interested about and I'm still learning about more and more by the day. And I think it's the being able to satiate that general curiosity, which is something, you know, that maybe would have never happened if I didn't, you know, if I didn't have my parents, if I didn't have specific things.
That's so important. And I think more parents should do that. I wish my parents did. I don't blame them again, but I wish they told me more about Mexico. Except I have to give my mom credit. Somos tarumaras. That was very cool.
I think that's the pinnacle of all of this, and I think the best way to summarize everything we kind of talked about today is that phrase. Sorry, I'm a little bad with Spanish. Can you repeat that one phrase?
Somos tarumaras.
And I think that this is who you are.
It really says that all of us have indigenous roots in Mexico. There's a lot of Mexico's all kinds of people, but our deepest root is the indigenous, and we can all tap into that, and that's very important.
And the thing is, going back to what your mom said, never forgetting it.
Yeah, no.
Because it's like, you know, all of this, because all of this is history. Yeah. Everything that you've done, that has happened is history. And the thing is, you know, we are doomed to repeat it. Yeah. If we don't remember.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the one thing I love about history, and especially doing this as well. Yeah. It's like you got to really understand what happened on the ground. Because it's one thing to read it. Yeah. It's one thing to it's one thing to read about the temples in Mexico. It's one thing to do other things. But when you really get to hear from someone, I was there, this is how it was like. Yeah. It's a whole nother experience.
And people my age, I'm in my early 70s now, we're still around, and we need to, it's our job to help impart what we know.
Right. And building off of you, it not only helps us like understand the history, but also understand ourselves at the same time. Yeah. I noticed this while taking Chicanos courses at a community college. I noticed this while attending Knox. This is I just came back from Knox to our viewers from all the way in New Mexico, in Albuquerque. So I feel like going to these events, you know, learning our history helps me understand who I am as a person and where I came from.
That's great. That's beautiful. I'm so glad. I'm so glad we connect.
I think we're almost out of time. So unless you have one more question, you want to make a final statement.
One question. We can choose to include this or not. But last year you recommended this song, "A Change Is Gonna Come" by Sam Cooke, and I wanted to ask you really quick, what does that song mean to you, and how is it how would you say it resonates with your life?
Well, it was a song that was different than other songs. You know, most songs in the 60s were love songs, which is fine. You know, the oldies, everybody falls in love. We're all romantics. Even the artist Cholo was a romantic. But here is a song about society, about the world, the change is going to come. Because we were all feeling hopeless and helpless and rootless, you know. And then he says, the change is going to come. I was like, yes. Maybe not everybody took it the way I did, but I was looking for a change. I was so hungry. And my mentor told me, you're the most. I was really down, but I was the hungriest of everyone. I wanted give me more knowledge, more awareness, teach me things. I was hungry to learn. I think that's what that song means. The change is going to come, but you got to be hungry, and then you got to feed it. Feed your mind, feed your spirit, feed the best part of you. Yeah. And I think that's what happened, and that's why I love that song. Change is going to come, but we got to be prepared for that change.
I think we should end it on that. I think that was really.
I do have two questions. One, because I wish we would have got to it, but I'm gonna ask it now. Tia Chuchas, can you go over that?
Oh, yeah.
Why you named that in honor of your
Very
tia,
important.
and then how the reason for starting that.
So Tia Chucha was the eccentric. They say eccentric. She was a very independent, creative woman. And in Mexico, that was hard to be. Mm-hmm. But she didn't follow any of the lines. She did poetry. She had played guitar, had a guitar in her back. She played violin. She painted. She did her own colognes and perfumes. She was in her own, like they say, a different drummer. She followed that. Everybody in my family, to distance themselves, would say she was loca. Mm-hmm. Something's wrong with her. She's crazy. She wasn't. Now, nobody liked her very much. She'd come and visit us from Mexico City once in a while. I was totally intrigued by her. I said, my tia, she was so alive, full of life. And so I really loved that spirit. And she was trying to teach me guitar, and it's part of a poem I wrote. But she passed, by the way. And when I was thinking about what am I going to name this press that I created for this book and eventually other people, I'm going to name it for my tia. And then when I came back from LA from Chicago, which is 25 years ago. A year later, we started Tia Chucha Centro Cultural and Bookstore. I named it for her to honor that spirit.
Right. And for whoever's in Los Angeles, that's in Silmar.
Yeah, it's in Silmar, California. Yeah, absolutely.
And then beyond Tia Chuchas and that bookstore, is any other places where people can connect with you if they want to?
They got a website. My website is luisjrodriguez.com. I also recommend the Tia Chucha website, tiachucha.org, because you'll find all the activities we're doing. And you'll find me on the web. And if you go to YouTube, I didn't realize there was a bunch of stuff on there about me, even including the 2 TED Talks I've done. If you go to Google me, the Wikipedia, a bunch of stuff I didn't even know. Some people telling me. And then I started looking at there's a lot of stuff on there. And even on Spotify, I have music with my poetry. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see My Name Is Not Rodriguez, a whole album. It's on Spotify. And including the album that Tia Chucha made that includes a beautiful song that I did in Italy. It's like a hip-hop beat, and it's called Civilization. And it's in there. So go look me up, Luis Javier Rodriguez on Spotify, and I even pop up there.
I'll check it out. I'll send it to him after this.
And then, is there any last thing, anything you want to say to wrap this up that you feel like?
Well, it's unsaid? Just, again, maybe to go back to something we were saying. Destiny is a decision you make. It means the destination you're going. And you're right about fate. Fate comes in and things we can't control. Who we're born with, who our parents are, you're Mexican or you're black, you're white, whatever. These are things you can't control, but you can control the kind of person you are. Mm-hmm. And that character has to be big enough and expansive enough to incorporate what your own gifts are. And that's pretty powerful. And if people can do that, they're going to live the life they were meant to live.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't...
You want to play that song you sing?
Might have that in the outro, actually. Yeah, that might be a nice outro.
That would be a nice outro. I think we're out of time, though.
Yeah, I think we're out of time. So thank you very much for watching this episode. Thank you again, Luis.
Yes,
and if you are watching from YouTube, please go ahead and like and subscribe so we can continue making this content for you. And thank you once again, Luis.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate you both.